looking back at the last decade of cinema, I think it's impossible not to look at the huge significant shift that has occurred in the way that films are distributed, thanks or because, of course, of Netflix and everything that has been brought upon by the streaming revolution. It's not been a conscious decision on my part, but over the course of the last 10 years, I've purchased less and less physical media to the point where I can't remember the last time that I actually went out and bought a Blu-ray. Now, all of my home viewing is enjoyed through streaming services, whether that be Netflix, Amazon Prime, or Mubi. Our relationship with media, with the way we consume it, has profoundly changed. YouTube certainly existed back in 2010 and was probably a really fun time for creators to explore that platform rather than try and stand out in the dystopian corporate wasteland that it's become. But certainly I didn't have a steady diet of YouTube channels that I would regularly binge as much as I do today. YouTube at the time was more about, hey, check out this funny video, and now it's essentially replaced television. I can't, for the life of me, remember the last time I watched an actual program on television outside of live sporting events. Now, whether the death of physical media and of traditional television is a good or a bad thing, I don't really have that much of an opinion one way or the other. I think it's both extraordinarily positive. It provides and allows films to be accessible to everyone, and at the same time, it also comes with the caveat of you not actually owning those films. Film as an object, whether it be a print that is played in the theater or a home video that you own and treasure forever, like I still have VHSs, that is going to disappear forever, and film now is a consumable service, and you fully accept the idea that nothing really belongs to you and that things can disappear at any given time. As for the theatrical experience, what has that become? As someone who is still a major proponent of the theatrical experience and who really does see the value in seeing films in theaters, I still think that the traditional theatrical experience is a very strong and viable option. However, much like the ever-growing number of streaming services, it's more segmented than ever before. On the one hand, you have these bigger and bigger chain multiplex theaters that seem to play only the major blockbuster releases from a few studios, where more independent and foreign films have been completely pushed aside, so you have more and more screens, and yet it seems less and less choice. And on the other hand, within larger cities, there's still a wealth of tremendous independent cinemas where they'll play more challenging films, where the quality of the presentation is of the utmost priority. It seems like the film experience, and thus the spectator experience, has never been more fragmented. You can almost curate your own little film world by only going to art house theaters and subscribing to services such as Mubi or the Criterion Channel, or on the other hand, only set foot within larger multiplex movie theaters and live off of Marvel DC films, Disney remakes, Star Wars, and whatever Blumhouse movie is out. And on the one hand, it is wonderful to have that much choice, but at the same time, it does feel like the film conversation just isn't this one singular conversation anymore. It's a series of fragmented little bubbles that people exist within. And the accessibility of cinema to cinema is incredibly uneven for people, let's say, that live in major metropolitan areas versus people that live in more suburban, rural areas. As for the films themselves, it certainly feels as if the bigger blockbusters have taken a page from serialized television. Whether streaming has had anything to do with that, I don't know, but it seems like nothing can stand on its own. Brand recognition today is everything, and if I want to be perfectly fair, maybe that's always been a thing. Maybe before that, the brands were the actors. You went and saw the new Marlon Brando film. You went and saw the new Rock Hudson film. That was the recognizable entity on which you bankrolled your film. But now that doesn't exist anymore. The era of the movie star seems to have completely disappeared, and now we live in the era of the franchise, where everything has to be a recognizable character or a recognizable name or brand or universe. Cinema has always been an industry, and film studios were always run like businesses, sometimes ruthlessly. But at least they were movie businesses. Once they became acquired by larger publicly held conglomerates, it seemed like they're not even in the movie business anymore. They're in the money business. It just so happens that they make films. And I think that's why people tend to be very nostalgic of cinema from before the 80s. People like to talk about the death of cinema all the time. I'm not really sure what that means. If that's just a way for grumpy old people to say that movies were better then and that movies are terrible now, I don't agree with that. I think there's still just such a huge variety of incredible films coming out every year, and it's probably easier than ever to have access to those films. For how long, I'm not sure, but we live in a very strange but very exciting time. However, I will say that the biggest danger that I see going forward is the fact that there are less and less movie studios, and that they are part of these giant mega conglomerations that are now being purchased up by even bigger conglomerations. The Disney-Fox merger is the prime example of that. The fact that Disney has its own streaming service, the fact that Netflix is now producing its own films for its own streaming service, that to me is one of the danger that will lurk cinema and the movie industry within the next decade. Is, will there be enough companies, enough people to produce and distribute these incredible voices that are popping up from around the world? Or will we live in this post-apocalyptic Walmart future where just one company controls everything and distributes in every cinema that it probably owns and across every streaming platform that it owns as well, and the only dissenting voices of independence will exist within small film festivals or maybe on these small little niche movie services? And preserving that plurality, that possibility of diffusing art everywhere, that really is going to be, over the coming decade, probably the biggest challenge that the movie industry will face. Before I start counting down my top 50 films of the decade, I would like to start off by saying that I'm not going to use any film clips. I really like to use clips to illustrate what I'm saying. I think it just makes the video that much more interesting. However, because of the amount of clips that would require, there's just such a massive exponential possibility of getting flagged and having the video blocked or removed sometimes, and I just don't want to have to deal with those copyright issues. Unfortunately, YouTube is what it is. Sometimes the algorithm will just leave you alone and you could put tons of clips and you're in the clear. Sometimes you'll just have this one little tiny clip and the entire thing will be blocked worldwide. And I just really don't want to have to deal with that. And secondly, before I start the list, I would like to give a special / honorable mention to one of the best pieces of media I saw all decade, and that is David Lynch's Twin Peaks: The Return. Easily the best piece of television I saw all decade. I can't tell you the excitement that I had anticipating every week's episode, and actually the fact that there was that week's breathing space between episodes, and that every episode had the time to sit with you and breathe, and then you could think about what was going to happen next. It really worked for Twin Peaks: The Return, and was a tremendous example that there is still something to that form that, you know, in the era of Netflix just dumping an entire series and you binge watching all 13 episodes in one go, the actual act of sitting down at a certain hour in front of your television and watching 1 hour, one episode unfurl and waiting until next week to see what happens next, it still has its place, and it still works, and it's still a viable way to distribute television. Now, I didn't include it in the list. I could have. It is almost a 17-hour sequel to Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me more than it is almost a third season of the Twin Peaks television series. However, because of the way that I saw it in that fragmented episodic format, I will consider it television. But to each his own, it clearly is the closest thing we got to a David Lynch film this decade, and that needs to be treasured. You know, if I were to put it on my list, it would be very, very high, because I think it is a tremendous, remarkable achievement. And so here we are, the top 50 best films of the decade, my favorite films of the decade, should I say. It's a very imperfect list. It is what it is. It's, according to obviously my own sensibilities and what I was able to see. There's still so many movies that I wished that I could have seen in preparation for the list, but unfortunately, I just didn't have the time. And even for certain films, I couldn't rewatch them, so I'm just going off pure memory. But again, what is film if not memory and emotion and just remembering where you were at a certain time when you saw something? And I've been talking for too long, so let's just get into it. At number 50, it's Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, a film that I've talked about quite a bit over the last few months. It did a review for it back in November. It was on my best films of 2019, so I really don't have that much more to say about it. It's wonderful. Martin Scorsese quietly had a tremendous decade between this and Silence, The Wolf of Wall Street, Hugo, Shutter Island, which could have easily made the list as well. If you compare him to like his contemporaries, he is still an absolute master, well into his 70s, creating tremendous films, and is still one of the more interesting American filmmakers. So at number 50, it's Martin Scorsese's The Irishman. I know we're not supposed to like Roman Polanski, and he is probably a terrible human being, and I fully understand people not wanting to watch his films because of who he is or what he's done, but it has to be said, the man is a tremendous filmmaker. And at number 49, it's The Ghostwriter, easily one of the best thrillers of the decade, and easily Pierce Brosnan's best role. Number 48 is First Man by Damien Chazelle, a beautiful, beautiful biopic of Neil Armstrong, a story about a man who needs to mourn and has to go to the loneliest place in the universe and isolate himself from all of humanity in order to grieve the death of his daughter. It's beautiful, it's intimate, it's epic, it's gorgeously shot. It is my number 48 best film of the decade. Remakes can be great if they're done well. At number 47, it's Takashi Miike's 13 Assassins, which takes everything that's great about the original, but brings that crazy Takashi Miike flair. And I say crazy, but it's extremely restrained in context of his cinema. Takashi Miike's kind of hit or miss for me. He's made, so many movies. He's got to be one of the most prolific filmmakers ever. And I don't like all of his movies, but when he is on his game, he's one of the best genre filmmakers working today. At number 47, it is 13 Assassins. My number 46 is Carlos by Olivier Assayas, which is, again, we were talking about Twin Peaks earlier, an interesting sort of exploration into that porous frontier that exists between cinema, television, streaming. The film was, I think, financed by a French television channel to play on Canal+, which is French television, but it also played film festivals as 3 individual films back to back. I saw it as 3 films in the theaters, but not back to back. I think, if I recall correctly, they were playing them in the theater each day, and then it played television. I think there was an international version even where they took those 3 episodes and cut it down to a 2-hour version, which I haven't seen. But essentially, because I saw it in theaters and it works as this whole, I decided to add it to my list. It's just, again, a tremendous biopic of the infamous terrorist Carlos. It is number 46, and it is Carlos by Olivier Assayas. My number 45 is The Wailing, easily the best horror film that I've seen all decade. Na Hong Jin is one of my favorite filmmakers. I think he's made 3 amazing films, but this is his most complex, most interesting film, probably. The way it blends different genres from horror to thriller to comedy is incredible, and it's a mark of some of the best Korean films and the best Korean filmmakers. They're able to just flow from style to genre in a way that's unparalleled. There's a sense of dread and just imminent danger that pervades throughout the 2 hours and 30 minutes that the film runs for. And it has that thing that I love where it basically gives you the solution within like the first 25 minutes. But because it's kind of too simple a solution, and because you've seen other movies before, you're like, well, that can't be it. They're gonna find out what's really going on. And it turns out, no, it was Occam's razor. What they told you was what was going on. And the way it goes about it is masterful. At number 45, it's Na Hong Jin's The Wailing. My number 44 is Boxing Gym by Frederick Wiseman. Wiseman is quite possibly the greatest living documentary filmmaker. And he, again, like somebody like Scorsese, has quietly had a tremendous decade. He's known for his fly-on-the-wall documentaries where he generally picks an area, an institution, a neighborhood in which he puts his camera and just quietly observes what's going on. And what's fascinating about Boxing Gym in comparison to, say, his other wonderful films that he's made this decade, like At Berkeley, like National Gallery, is that it seems more modest in its approach, but it's maybe the most beautiful in terms of the human stories that it tells. There's something about a boxing gym where it acts as this melting pot for every possible social and racial dynamic within the United States, and so the film explores that in a way that's incredibly beautiful. At number 44, it's Frederick Wiseman's Boxing Gym. At number 43 is Drive by Nicholas Winding Refn. I don't think there's been a film over the course of this decade that's been more influential. You can clearly see the heap of movies, of commercials, of student films that were inspired by the look and the sound of Drive, to the point where there was a moment where I kind of disliked the film, not because of the film itself, but because of all the copycats, and because it was sort of that cliched film that every douchebag, had a poster for in his dorm room. But I think that the film in and of itself is quite tremendous. It's an amazing exercise in quiet genre, and there's a reason that it was so influential, although I don't think I ever want to hear a Kavinsky song ever again. At number 42, I've put Room 237 by Rodney Asher. Now, I know a lot of people who actually don't like the film because they think the theories that the people are advancing within the films are ridiculous. And to me, that's actually why I love it. To me, that's kind of the point. The documentary functions as a dive into the psyche of the kind of person that really spends and devotes their lives to overanalyzing a piece of art, and maybe instead of working on their own issues. And in the era of the YouTube video essay, I think the film also functions as this incredible, almost self-reflexive piece of filmmaking on the emergence of a new genre. And it's a film that I find endlessly fascinating for that. It is Room 237 by Rodney Asher. At number 41, it's Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol by Brad Bird. If nothing else, this past decade has been the rebirth of Tom Cruise as a movie star. If you remember the mid-2000s, he was a complete joke at a certain point. And the films that he was involved in were very much tainted by his media perception, by his public perception, and by everything that was going on with his private life. Now he seems to have really shifted away from that and has become a media darling once again, and really a darling of film lovers everywhere. And that comeback for me really was with Ghost Protocol. It was the first time that I can recall where Tom Cruise doing his own stunts and the production company releasing stills and videos of Tom Cruise doing his stunts was actually part of the promotional material for the film. It's also a great example of a franchise reinvigorating itself after a second episode that not many people like, and that's kind of weird, and a third one that's fine but extremely forgettable. But now Mission Impossible has become one of the most beloved action franchises out there that really delights mainstream movie audiences and film snobs alike. I could have put Edge of Tomorrow on this list, which I think is a tremendously underseen and underappreciated action blockbuster sci-fi masterpiece, but in this, the sort of practical analog filmmaking really cemented this return to form for Cruise, for the franchise, and it's a film that I absolutely love. It is Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. Number 40 is Stranger by the Lake by Alain Guiraudie. I suppose you could call this film a thriller, although because it's Guiraudie, it kind of defies genre. It essentially acts as a series of conversations between two characters that are in this nudist colony by a lake in the south of France that is frequented by the homosexual community, where they basically go there, meet, and have sex in the woods. All of a sudden, some bodies start turning up, and the person that is suspected is also this very handsome, mustached Adonis, and because he's so hot, the main character hesitates to maybe act on his suspicions and call the police, because he finds himself completely locked within these pulsions of desire, of sexuality, but also maybe fascination with death, and it culminates in this incredible, surreal chase in the woods. It's a tremendous film by French director Alain Guiraudie. It is Stranger by the Lake. Number 39 is Werner Herzog's Into the Abyss. I had to get some Werner in there, obviously. Into the Abyss started out as an episode for a television series that he was doing called On Death Row, I believe, but in this particular case that he explores within Into the Abyss, there was so much there that they decided to turn it into a feature film, and it is just this tremendously powerful and extremely emotional exploration into a horrible case. I can't remember all the details, but it is about this young man who killed, I believe, an entire family, including children, and he's on death row, and he's going to be killed, and the whole film is an exploration into that case and also into the death penalty as an institution. Herzog obviously is against the death penalty, for example, as am I. But because it's Herzog, it also is transformed into this almost transcendental piece on nature and human nature. And there's this incredible interview with one of the family members, I believe it's the sister of the woman and the children who were killed. She explains that she is so glad that the murderer is going to be killed and that she wants to be there to see him die. And of course, again, I'm still fervently against the death penalty, but it's in those instances that, although it doesn't change my mind, it does make me realize that if I were in her position, I would probably want the same thing, because it's profoundly human to want revenge. But then the question you have to ask yourself is, as a wider society, is revenge justice? And I sort of believe that it isn't, but that doesn't prevent the documentary from being just absolutely emotionally devastating. It's beautiful. It's Werner Herzog. It is Into the Abyss. Number 38 is I Am Not Your Negro by Raoul Peck. I'm really fascinated by how you tell stories through archival footage, through voiceover, through photographs. That's something that obviously Ken Burns does amazingly well. And with the texts of James Baldwin, Raoul Peck is able to craft an incredibly engaging and powerful documentary. Number 38, it is I Am Not Your Negro by Raoul Peck. Number 37 is Wes Anderson's love letter to Japanese cinema. It is Isle of Dogs, a film that is beautiful in its stop-motion animation, a style that really makes all of his qualities really shine, and that sort of hides anything that can be irritating about his cinema. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a story not just about treating dogs with respect, but about treating people with respect. It's a story about genocide and about, the migrant crisis. It's extraordinarily resonant. It's beautiful. It's amazingly put together. It's funny. It's touching. It is Wes Anderson's I Love Dogs. Number 36 is Richard Linklater's Boyhood, a film that took 12 years to make. Every so often they'd get together with the actors and just shoot a little bit, and it really could be a gimmick, but it's totally not. It's beautiful, it's resonant, it's one of the most powerful films ever made about growing up, and it almost could be a French New Wave film, except it's set in Austin. It's incredible. It's Richard Linklater's Boyhood. Number 35 is Manchester by the Sea by Kenneth Lonergan. It's extremely difficult to pull off a film that is that dramatic and that is that dark and leave the theater feeling like all of that horror, all of that drama was perfectly earned and didn't feel artificial. And it's also a tremendously funny movie that at its heart has, the death of one's children, possibly the most horrific thing one can go through. It is American independent cinema at its finest, written by one of its finest screenwriters. It is Kenneth Lonergan's Manchester by the Sea. Number 34 is Sarah Polley's beautiful, beautiful, very personal autobiographical documentary called Stories We Tell, which really explores her own story, the story of her parents. It's possibly one of the most beautiful declarations of love that a daughter has made to her father ever. And I don't want to spoil it if you're not aware of the story, because it's such a crazy little kooky story that it really could only be made into a movie. The way it explores format and archival footage and films that are shot today with actors but made to look like archival footage. It is at number 34, Stories We Tell by Sarah Polley. Number 33 is Son of Saul by Laszlo Nemes, a film that I don't really ever want to see again, I suppose, for obvious reasons. I don't remember a film that was as draining an experience, particularly just coming out of the theater, walking home, and just sitting in my apartment for 20 minutes, taking it all in and breathing it in. It was an extremely powerful, resonant experience and a perfect example of how you use form to complement theme and story, and is without a doubt the best sort of visualization and recreation of the death camps that I've seen in a fiction film up to now. At number 33, it's Son of Saul by Laszlo Nemes. Number 32 is Undefeated by Daniel Lindsay and TJ Martin. Undefeated is a documentary about football. It's a documentary about sports, but it's a documentary about football for people who don't care at all about football, because it's a documentary about family. It's a documentary about mentorship. It's a documentary about how sports is more than winning or losing. It doesn't really matter the fact that this team is undefeated. What makes the team great is each other, the people that are a part of the team, and the team of coaches that are supervising them and turning these young boys into men and preparing them for the real world. Not just playing college football, not just maybe one day potentially the NFL, but for the real world. It's a tremendous documentary, and it is Undefeated at number 32. Number 31 is Chiro Guerra's gorgeous black and white Embrace of the Serpent. I don't know what it is about people going up the Amazon in a canoe. It's something that I am instantly drawn to. One of my favorite films of all time is Aguirre, Wrath of God, a film that I didn't put on this list but could and was quite close to getting in was James Gray's The Lost City of Z, and with Chiro Guerra's Embrace the Serpent, it takes everything that I love about exploring the jungle. It is a film that is surrounded by sort of indigenous beliefs and mysticism, and is absolutely beautiful and entrancing. It is Chiro Guerra's Embrace of the Serpent. My number 30 is Taxi by Jafar Panahi, a film that he made still while not being allowed by the Iranian government to make films. And so he hid these 3 little black magic pocket cameras within his car and basically used his car as a little mobile studio under the pretense of, being a taxi in order to pay for his bills, because you can't make movies anymore. It's delightful, it's funny, it's touching, it is incredibly political, and the fact that a guy with a car and 3 cameras who has the power of the Iranian government falling upon him, trying to prevent him from making films, is able to make films and is able to make these beautiful, amazing films like Taxi. It makes me almost ashamed to be in a position where, I don't have any restrictions ultimately, and not having done a, 100th of what this guy is capable of. So at number 30, it's Jafar Panahi's Taxi. My number 29 is Carol by Todd Haynes, one of the most beautiful, powerful love stories that was told during this decade, an amazing adaptation of the Patricia Highsmith novel. Carol is an incredibly simple film, but with a level of care, a level of craft, a level of acting that is so amazing and breathtaking that there really aren't that many things to say about the movie. It's the kind of film where you go out and are speechless at its beauty and marvel at its simplicity. And it is an amazing, amazing love story told by Todd Haynes. It's amazingly deep and profound, and yet extraordinarily simple. At number 29, it's Carol by Todd Haynes. Number 28 is My Mother, or Mia Madre by Nanni Moretti. My Mother is this incredibly bittersweet, beautiful tale of a film director who is kind of undergoing a artistic crisis and is trying to tell this incredibly powerful political story, all the while her mother is in the hospital and is about to die. It's extraordinarily simple. It's incredibly funny and touching. John Turturro plays this American actor that goes to Italy because he loves Italian cinema, and so he wants to act in this kind of international auteur type of film, and he is absolutely hilarious. John Turturro should be in every movie as of now because he would make any movie better. And Nanni Moretti plays this kind of asshole, narcissistic, self-absorbed brother, and he does it brilliantly, and he's really funny. My Mother, Mia Madre by Nanni Moretti is at number 28. Number 27 is 12 O'Clock Boys by Lofty Nathan. The 12 O'Clock Boys are a gang in Baltimore, and they're not a gang that sells drugs or does extortion or is violent. They are a gang that ride the cities of Baltimore on their motorcycles at extreme speed, doing these mad wheelies and basically reappropriating the urban space. The film follows Pug, a 12 or 13-year-old boy who desperately wants to become a 12 o'clock boy, but obviously the film is about more than that, in that it's almost an observation into a community that's been so ghettoized and so ostracized that riding their motorcycles almost becomes like an act of defiance, like almost an act of creation. It becomes something artistic. The film kind of shows this by shooting with phantom cameras, and you see like these incredible scenes of these kids doing wheelies at 1,000 frames per second, and it's gorgeous. If there was an award for best wheelies of the decade, there certainly would be a few in here. At number 27, it is 12 O'Clock Boys. Number 26 is Loveless by Andrzej Zvyagintsev, an incredibly beautiful, powerful, and dark story about a couple who's going through a divorce, and one day their child goes missing. Is he dead? Has he run away? We don't know, but they're pretty bad parents. Not one of them wanted to keep him in the divorce. They wanted to push him onto the other parent, and so the fact that he disappeared is kind of convenient. I mean, they are trying to find him to keep up appearances, but in a way, it doesn't bother them as much as, it should bother a parent who's lost their child. It's tremendously dark, and it's about tremendously bad, self-absorbed, disgusting people, but it's also an amazing film. It's at number 26, Andrei Zvyagintsev's Loveless. Number 25 is Parasite, a film that I've talked about quite a bit recently. I did a review. It was my number one film of 2019. Just a masterful exercise in filmmaking. I don't need to blabber on about this film. It's winning every award possible. It's now the frontrunner for the Oscars, which is crazy to think that a foreign language film will possibly win the best film award at the Oscars. So it's getting all the love that it needs. It doesn't need any more. Number 25 is Bong Joon-ho's Parasite. Number 24 is Mami by Xavier Dolan. Xavier Dolan does get called a prodigy quite a lot. Sometimes it's deserved, other times not so much, but Mami is just an extraordinarily powerful filmic experience. One of the best uses of changing aspect ratios I've seen in a film ever. And it's a film where people are on the edge of breaking down at any moment. People are yelling, people are screaming, emotions are always running high. It is absolute pure melodrama, but it is extraordinarily well made, extraordinarily well acted, extraordinarily powerful, and that 1:1 square, almost Instagram-esque aspect ratio just boxes in its main characters to a point that is almost suffocating. And that scene where the main character just pushes out the boundaries, and you get for a little while a wider aspect format when things are going well. It's just so liberating, so freeing, and then to see that get boxed in again, it's heartbreaking. It's a beautiful, beautiful film from Quebec, an area that is a place that is near and dear to my heart. Obviously, at number 24, it is Mami by Xavier Dolan. Number 23 is Oslo, August 31st by Joachim Trier, a tremendously dark story of a young adult who comes out of rehab for a day to pass some work interviews, and things don't go as planned, and he falls back into using, and he's basically decided to kill himself. It is a day in the life type of film, and it is just tremendously emotionally resonant, and I still think about that film. It hurts a lot. It's a film about pain, and it's painful, but it's also incredibly touching and moving and powerful. It is Oslo, August 31st by Joachim Trier. Number 22 is Tonnerre by Guillaume Braque. A very simple story about a struggling musician who's in his 30s who moves back to his dad's house in the French countryside in Burgundy, and he falls in love with this very young girl that's like maybe in her late teens, early 20s. They start dating, and he really kind of falls madly in love with her. He really doesn't have all that much going on as well. Like I said, everything in his professional and personal life is kind of a mess. But obviously, she's young and she wants to have fun, and so she doesn't take the relationship that seriously, and so she stops seeing him and she starts seeing this other guy. And from there, the film devolves into this really dark space about somebody who's incredibly lonely. It's a beautiful, beautiful first film by Guillaume Braque. It is Tonnerre at number 22. Number 21 is Jajanke's A Touch of Sin. I've talked about Jajanke quite a bit on the channel in the last year because obviously he released Ash's Purest White in the last year, and it was on my best films of 2019. A Touch of Sin is possibly his masterpiece, and that's saying something because he's made quite a lot of tremendous films, but I feel it sort of encapsulates everything you need to know about him as a filmmaker. It's these 4 little short stories set in modern-day China that are all tragic and dark. I'm really quite amazed about how far Chinese filmmakers can go in criticizing contemporary Chinese society, considering how repressed and how controlled society is over there, but they really have some amazing filmmakers coming out of there. Obviously, Jajangke, chief among them. Number 21 is A Touch of Sin by Jajangke. Number 20 is OJ's Made in America. Again, a contentious one because it is an ESPN documentary and it aired on ESPN, but it also played in theaters, and, I think it was eligible and won an Oscar the year it was released. So I'm considering it as a film. And I don't know if there is a definitive documentary on race in America. I hesitate to use that word, but this one would be one of them for sure. It's about so much more than just the OJ trial, which in and of itself is absolutely fascinating, but it is essentially about race relations in California from the 1960s to modern day, and it is a breathtaking piece of filmmaking. At number 20, it is OJ Made in America by Ezra Edelman. Number 19 is Foxcatcher by Bennett Miller, a really strange story about a strange individual in Jan DuPont, this ultra-billionaire that decided all of a sudden that he was passionate about wrestling and started financing his own private wrestling team and sent many U.S. wrestlers to the Olympics and was looking after them, and they were living on his compound and training over there, and all of a sudden murdered one of them. I can't remember the name. Just strange, surreal exploration into a crazy, crazy individual. It's a weird story, and it's amazingly well put together with some tremendous performances. Steve Carell's best performance by far. And Mark Ruffalo's in there, so it's quality. It is Foxcatcher by Bennett Miller. Wouldn't it be just wonderful if we lived in a world where Jonathan Glazer made more movies? Now, unfortunately, he's not that prolific, but the films that he does provide us with are breathtakingly beautiful and powerful and pretty much unforgettable. Under the Skin is no exception. Some of the imagery from this film still haunts me to this day. I will forever remember that image of the little baby crying on the sand alone with the beach as a backdrop. It's such a powerful image. All of the sequences in the dark room that were then flat out copied in things like Stranger Things or Get Out. It's one of those films that when it came out maybe didn't have the success it deserved, but will unquestionably influence sci-fi for decades to come. At number 18, it is Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer. Number 17 is Take Shelter by Jeff Nichols. I am an absolute lover and admirer of Jeff Nichols' cinema. I could have easily put any of the films that he's made during this decade on this list, whether it's this film, whether it's Mud, whether it's Loving, whether it's Midnight Special. But I felt like Take Shelter was really my first introduction to the cinema of Jeff Nichols. It's such a powerful film about paranoia and mental illness, and Michael Shannon gives one of his best performances, and again, that's saying something considering the man is a national treasure. I really think that Jeff Nichols is one of the most criminally underrated directors working in America today. Loving, which is a film that I forgot to mention and didn't get that much fanfare when it came out, and is just a sublime story set against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. But again, I feel like Take Shelter really has everything that I love about his cinema, plus it injects this paranoia, mental illness, almost sci-fi element as a metaphor, and it's a beautiful, beautiful film. At number 17, it is Jeff Nichols' Take Shelter. Number 16 is Inherent Vice by Paul Thomas Anderson, a film that I feel is criminally underrated and that one day will be reevaluated and appreciated along the same lines of something like, say, the Coen brothers' Big Lebowski. I find the film hilarious. It's gorgeously shot by Robert Elswit, who shoots Los Angeles like maybe no other director of photography. It's weird and surreal and on drugs, and it really perfectly captures the feeling of paranoia of the late 60s, early 70s, that end of an era, end of an ideal type feeling. It's one of my favorite Joaquin Phoenix performances, which is saying something considering how much of a genius the man is. And it's just a great LA movie. So at number 16, it is Paul Thomas Anderson's Inherent Vice. Number 15 is No by Pablo Larraín, a deliciously funny, amazingly acted, well put together film that also happens to be against the backdrop of this really insane event if you think about it. So in 1988, General Pinochet, who was the dictator who was running Chile, basically decided to hold a referendum as to whether or not he was going to keep power or whether he was going to leave. And he was so sure of his victory that he actually decided to follow the democratic process. And 2 ad agencies were then tasked with creating ad campaigns for the yes, he must remain, or no, he must leave. And this is where Gael Garcia Bernal comes in, as he works for the agency that has the unfortunate and very difficult task of going against General Pinochet's re-election. And wouldn't you know it, they made these hilarious ads that ended up being extraordinarily important in the campaign. And wouldn't you know that in 1988, Pinochet left power and Chile essentially transitioned into a more democratic state. So it's a fascinating era. It's amazingly put together. It's shot with these old 1980s video cameras, so it looks like it was shot back then, and that really adds to the realism and also sort of makes the whole experience kind of surreal because it feels like it was shot on home video, which it essentially was. Gael Garcia Bernal is magnetic. At 15, it is Pablo Larraín's No. At number 14, it is my favorite Hirokazu Koreeda film, and that may well be because it was the first that I've seen, and it is After the Storm, which is an interesting choice because most people would go towards Shoplifters, which won the Palme d'Or at Cannes last year. But although I love that film, I felt that the film that made me really fall in love with Koreeda was After the Storm. It's a beautiful tale of what else, a father and a son, and it's told with all of the delicateness but also the cruelty that Koreeda is capable of. It's both funny and touching, and it's just an amazing film. It is Koreeda's After the Storm. Number 13 is Spring Breakers by Harmony Korine. With Drive, I mentioned how that film was incredibly influential aesthetically on films that came after it. Well, with Spring Breakers, I don't think you could argue the contrary. It is, alongside films like Drive or Under the Skin, one of the most influential films of the decade. After the film came out, every music video, ad, movie wanted to look like Spring Breakers, but they couldn't manage it because they didn't have Benoit Debie's insane vision and Harmony Korine's crazy sensibilities. Harmony Korine really is one of those singular filmmakers. He's the kind of guy that will find beauty in garbage. He loves the ugly and trashy side of America, and it's done in a way that's really unironic. He really finds beauty in that, and that sincerity is really what makes his cinema stand out. And Spring Breakers is the most crazy, insane, visual delight, almost assault on the senses that I can remember. It takes half-naked dudes and ladies with Skrillex music and neon colors flying in everywhere with the camera just kind of coming in and out on a Steadicam. It's completely insane. It also happens to be graced by James Franco's best ever performance, who is absolutely hilarious and amazing. And what can I say except Spring Break forever, baby. At number 13, it's Spring Breakers. Watching a Safdie brothers movie for the first time really is an experience unto itself. These guys make electrifying, intense, really anguish-filled movies. Films that are on a crazy pace that keeps going and going and going, and it never lets up. Robert Pattinson in the film is fantastic. He's really had a breakout decade as well. And Good Time is beautiful, the score is amazing, and Benny Safdie, who's one of the directors, also happens to play one of the characters and is amazing. It also features a fantastic Iggy Pop song. So really everything in this film is tailor-made to appeal to me. At number 12, it is the Safdie brothers' Good Time. Number 11 is Gravity, a film that is as thrilling as any film I've ever seen in a movie theater. A film that is almost like a theme park ride, but I say that in the best possible way. It is a visual feast. It all functions as a very simplistic metaphor on motherhood, but that holds the story together really well. If you were to study the screenplay to Gravity, it actually functions pretty beautifully, even though it doesn't have that much dialogue. Some amazing action set pieces. It kind of revolutionized the way you shoot in space, quote unquote. And again, a film that's incredibly influential and that so many people have tried to copy and emulate and have maybe not been very successful at. So at number 11, it's Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity. Number 10 is Taboo by Miguel Gomes. Taboo is one of those films that when you come out of it, you sort of reflect on your own existence, your own life, your own relationships. It's shot in absolutely gorgeous black and white. That whole Africa sequence, which is about the second half of the film, is some of the most sublime filmmaking I've seen all decade. And it really cements Miguel Gomes as one of the most interesting directors to come out of Europe. It's also got an amazing soundtrack. At number 10, it is Taboo by Miguel Gomes. Number 9 is Burning, which is probably one of those films that jumped up the most on a rewatch. I watched it the first time when it came out in theaters and thought it was great. I even placed it on my top 10 films of 2018. But seeing it again and knowing what it was and understanding its pace and understanding its language, it just went up so much more for me. It's really one of the most powerful films I've seen. The way the film shifts from a sort of love triangle to a thriller, but a thriller that's almost all within the main character's head. The way the film doesn't really tell you anything. It gives you little indications as to what's real and what's not and what you should pay attention to. And it has one of the most fire endings of the decade. It's just such a powerful, incredible film. At number 9, it's Lee Shang-dong's Burning. Number 8 is The Social Network, a film that really came in at the very beginning of the decade and almost defined it. Interestingly, when you look back on it, at the time you were like, oh, maybe they were kind of mean with Zuckerberg. I mean, they really played him out to be kind of a dick and kind of an asshole. But, you know, as the decade has gone on, the only criticism I would have with the film now is that they maybe don't go far enough. It's Fincher at its very best. It's him experimenting with the form because it's one of the first film he shot with red cameras. I think he'd shot Zodiac before that on very early digital cameras, but this is where he used the red for the first time, I believe, and he's sort of playing around with the look of digital and those super sharp Zeiss lenses that he uses wide open, so there's just a huge amount of background that's out of focus, which is an aesthetic that will be reused throughout the decade, really. It's a really incredible film, great score by Trent Reznor, and some of the best dialogue of the entire decade by Aaron Sorkin. At number 8, it is The Social Network by David Fincher. Number 7 is Inside Llewyn Davis by the Coen brothers. As someone who really values art and integrity in art, people that really believe in what they do in their craft, and craft in particular, I think, is a really underused and undercelebrated term. People like to refer themselves as artists, people want to be famous, but Llewyn Davis really is the kind of guy that's concerned with craft and with music, and he just happens to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. At the end of that film, when he walks off stage and is beaten down and has basically failed throughout every obstacle within the film, you hear Bob Dylan coming on stage, and that is going to be the figure for the folk music, for the sort of social revolution that's brewing. And it's just so touching. It's impossible for me not to tear up. The movie is gorgeously shot by Bruno Delbonnel. It functions like most Coen brother films on this almost biblical metaphor, or almost like a Greek tragedy or a Greek myth. Inside Llewyn Davis is number 7, and it is absolutely beautiful. My number 6 is another Alfonso Cuarón film, and it is the Netflix-released Roma, a film that is able to combine the most intimate of stories with the most epic of vistas. It's a film on which every technical aspect is incredible. Every visual is breathtakingly beautiful. The way it uses sound is incredible. I was lucky enough to see the film in Atomos, and it's one of the best uses of surround sound I've witnessed in a very, very long time. The way the camera is locked off and pans around in these circular motions is something that I will forever remember. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. And so at number 6, it is Alfonso Cuarón raising Fellini back from the dead in Roma. My number 5 is Snowpiercer by Bong Joon-ho, a film that was absolutely butchered upon its North American release by Harvey Weinstein, but in Europe, the print that played theaters was the normal Cannes print, and it is a fantastic action film that plays almost like a side-scrolling video game. It starts from the back of the train where all the poor people are, and it moves from left to right like Double Dragon or Turtles in Time until you get to the front of the train. It's amazingly crafted, it's grotesque, it's horrific, and it is one of Chris Evans' best performance. At number 5, it is Snowpiercer by Bong Joon-ho. At number 4 is another Paul Thomas Anderson film, and it is The Master. I was watching some director roundtables recently, and at one point somebody asked Greta Gerwig what is cinema, and she responded by saying, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. Well, if you ask me to define what a masterpiece is, I would say that I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. And when I saw The Master, that's exactly what I felt. It features amazing performances by both Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman, but let's not forget the terrific role that Amy Adams plays across the story. It's a film about power and the dark recesses of the mind, and it's also a film where Philip Seymour Hoffman gets to sing Slow Boat to China, and just for that, it's amazing. At number 4, it is The Master by Paul Thomas Anderson. My number 3 is Hayao Miyazaki's The Wind Rises. I'm not huge on animation. I'm even less interested in Japanese animation, and to be frank, I'm not that in love with Miyazaki's previous films. I can take them or leave them. So the fact that The Wind Rises absolutely had to be in my top 3 films of the decade should indicate how much I love this film and how much of an impact it had. I don't think I can recall a film making me cry as much as Wind Rises, the story of this young Japanese boy that survives the earthquake in the 1930s in Tokyo, and whose dream it is to fly, who can't fly, and so he then becomes an engineer and builds these beautiful, beautiful airplanes, but that unfortunately end up being used as death machines because he starts designing planes for the Japanese military that will, of course, be used in World War II. So if there was one animated film that absolutely had to be on this list, it is my number 3, The Wind Rises by Hayao Miyazaki. Number 2 is Mad Max Fury Road by George Miller. I remember when the film was in production for what seems like forever, where it seemed like it was going to be a gigantic mess, that nothing was going to come of it. They then spent years in post-production, and word from Tom Hardy, for example, who's in the movie, was that he really wasn't satisfied with what they had shot. And then the first trailer came out, and all of a sudden we all became cautiously optimistic, like, wait a second, this actually looks really good. And then the film dropped and was an absolute roller coaster, one of the most intense cinematic experiences I've ever had to live through. A film that I was actually physically tired when I came out of the screening. Not like with Son of Saul, where I was emotionally drained, but I felt physically drained, as if I had run a marathon, as if I was in that chase with the characters. And Mad Max Fury Road is now the yardstick with which every action film will be measured. It's action filmmaking at its finest. You know, scrap that, it's filmmaking at its finest. It is the kind of film that every young action filmmaker should dream about making, and the fact that it was made by a 74-year-old man who puts all those young directors to shame is even more incredible. At number 2, it is the amazing Mad Max Fury Road by George Miller. And finally, here we are. My number 1 is The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick. There was never any doubt in my mind that this wasn't going to be number 1. It was always placed in that number 1 position. For me, Terrence Malick is the kind of filmmaker that makes films that are the closest to almost an act of faith, a spiritual act. They kind of go above and beyond what cinema is capable of. They're almost on the frontier of experimental, and they function more as poetry than almost regular films. And when they work, they are absolutely sublime. It's a film about the creation of the universe, the largest possible entity out there, but it's also extremely intimate, about a boy trying to grow up with an overbearing father. A lot of films try to copy Malick's style, and particularly post Tree of Life, there was this return to very wide-angled close-ups and, you know, free-form, steady-cam kind of shots that were very reminiscent of Malick's work in Tree of Life, but I feel like Malick's the only one who can really pull it off, and I think that's kind of because of his sincerity. When any other filmmaker shoots a wheat field for 10 minutes, it feels like they don't know what they're doing. And yet somehow with Malick, you don't question it for a second, it works. Malick is one of those filmmakers that almost shouldn't have been a filmmaker. He would have been better off born in the 19th century, and he would have been an impressionist painter. He doesn't really even talk about his process. It's virtually impossible to find any text or videos of him talking about his films or the way he makes movies. He is almost a recluse, and he's fascinating for it. At number 1, it is my favorite film of the decade. It is Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. I would like to thank everybody that sat through this video that's probably way too long, and I would like to just thank everybody that is watching these videos, that subscribes, that shares, that comments, that likes, and, you know, just for taking the time out of your busy schedule to watch me ramble about movies. So as always, thank you very much for watching the video. Please be sure to hit the like button if you liked my ramblings, subscribe if you're new, and until next time, see ya.